Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lesson, which is titled A Brief History of the United States and Canada. And if I am presenting you with a lesson that purports to tell you the history of two different countries with over 300 years of history, and if you consider indigenous peoples' history way beyond that, obviously this is going to be a brief overview and is in no way intended to be an all-encompassing summary of the history of the United States and Canada. This is what we would call a drive-by from 35,000 feet. But since we're introducing the history and current events in Canada and the United States, it's important that you have a sense of the history. So let's talk about where the original inhabitants of the United States and Canada came from. And we refer to them as indigenous people, First Nations. The term we don't like to use is Indians because it's not very accurate, and they are not from India. So a long time ago, tens of thousands of years ago, the sea levels used to be lower. And as a result of that, there was a land bridge between Asia and what we now know as Alaska that allowed people to walk from Asia into North America. And they didn't realize they were doing that. They were just hunting for food and following their game. And magically, they ended up in North America, which is why indigenous peoples have some similarities to people from Asia. Over time, people spread all over North and South America. The red arrows here would indicate the path that they slowly, over the course of time, thousands of years, walked. And of course, rudimentary sailing ships were also possible, and so many of them sailed down the coast of the Americas as well. So over time, distinct indigenous tribes and cultures developed slowly, and we're talking a period of about 10,000 years. So depending on where they settled, depending on what the climate was like, their lifestyles were different. Remember, climate has a massive impact on how people live, from the way they eat, to the way they dress, to the way they build their homes and dwellings. So depending on where they ended up and the different climates they encountered, they developed very different lifestyles and tendencies. So indigenous people are by no means a monolith. They are by no means people that we can just throw into a bucket and say they're all the same. There were literally thousands of different tribes with thousands of different traditions and many, many, many different languages. So we'll talk about the major tribes of the USA and Canada, and if you have taken the MAPS test for North America, you may have had to interpret a map of Native American culture regions. And this particular map talks about different Native American economic activities. And again, they are regional, but there is definitely a connection to climate as well, in that the different economic activities would have to go hand in hand with what the climate is like in the various areas. So there were literally thousands of tribes, but this map shows the names of the most significant tribes. So again, if we're talking about how to interpret a map, the color codes, as represented in the map key here, represent the different economic activities. So blue, fishing, obviously that's going to be in coastal areas. Hunting in the inland areas, hunting and gathering in the areas that don't have very much rain, so there might be some nomadic tendencies there, and agriculture as well. So what was life like for indigenous peoples who lived here before European colonization? Again, we are painting with an extremely broad brush. But one thing I would invite you to do is look at the pictures here and the different types of structures that natives lived in, and ask yourself what might be the difference between living in this kind of structure versus living in this kind of structure versus living in this kind of structure. I'll give you a hint. I've already talked about it a few times during this lesson. Dwellings were made from locally available materials. Hey, there's the hint I was going to give you. It's the climate. You're not going to be building a structure like this in Southern California because you would not find enough trees to do it. You're definitely not going to be doing it in the desert Southwest either. Natives generally lived in harmony with the land and nature. So they left a very light footprint on the land. And for most native tribes, actually respecting the land and respecting the earth is part of their ethos, their culture, their way of being. And to be candid, some native tribes were very peaceful and some were very competitive and warlike. So this notion that all the natives were peaceful and lived in harmony with the land, it sounds great, but tribes went to war with each other. There were definitely conflicts and struggles for power, and the Native Americans did not conquer human foibles by any stretch of the imagination. They just represented those foibles in different ways. So now we're going to talk about the USA and Canada and what was similar and different about the history of each country. If you are taking notes on this presentation, I would invite you to draw a T-chart in your notes because it will make this particular portion of the lesson a lot easier to digest. So there are similarities and there are differences between the history of the United States and Canada. Obviously, they're both North American countries that were colonized by Europeans. So in the case of the United States, it was colonized by England, France, and Spain starting in the 1500s, where Canada was colonized by England and it should say France in the 1500s. After I record this lesson, I will add France to that slide. The United States, due to climate, the differences in climate led to a difference in culture, had distinct differences between the northern regions and the southern regions. So when we first became a country, the conflict and the differences between northerners and southerners were significant, eventually ending up in the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. In Canada, the French-speaking population became British subjects after the French-Indian War. If you had a good 8th grade social studies teacher, you should have some memory of the French and Indian War and how it eventually led to the American Revolution. In the United States, the Southern economy was dependent on cheap labor. It was an agricultural economy. It was all about growing food. It was all about growing cotton, and so having a cheap and easy labor supply was critical, and that is how Southerners and the United States justified the existence of slavery. In Canada, the English came later, and as soon as Great Britain was the colonial power in Canada, first of all, they allowed the French people to keep their language. They allowed them to keep their religion. So the French-speaking people in Canada have their own very distinct culture, especially in the province of Quebec and to a lesser degree New Brunswick. But they eventually became outnumbered and dominated by the English. But to this day, English and French are both official languages in Canada. And if you drive or fly into Canada, the first thing you'll see when you get off the plane or drive across the border is signs that are in English and French. Any signs having to do with the national government of Canada must be bilingual. This is a very key difference in the difference in cultures between the two countries. The United States fought a war to gain its independence from the British, whereas Canada was given its independence by the British after the American Civil War. There was concern that the United States might attack Canada to get control over it after the Civil War, and one of the ways the British tried to head that off was by giving Canada its independence. So we, the United States, are the only country that has ever won its independence from the British through war. All the other countries of the Commonwealth were given their independence, but about 100 years later. So let's take a look at European colonization. We're going back in time now, so this lesson is not necessarily chronological. And what European countries and empires laid claim to and had influence over different parts of the Americas. From 8th grade history, you should know that the 13 British colonies were right here, eventually fought a war against the British, gained independence, and that's how the United States was born. Soon after the United States was born, American settlers wanted to start crossing the mountains, entering the hinterlands, which back then were called the Northwest. But at that particular point in time, the French were there and the British were there, and they did not want Americans coming across the mountains. Thus, the French-Indian War. The reason Spanish is spoken in Mexico is because it was a colony of Spain, and Spain gained control of this area here, including what is now the southern half of Texas. And there were even Russian claims along Alaska. We actually purchased Alaska from Russia in the Civil War era. All right, so the French-Indian War was a war between the Americans, who were at that point still British colonies, and the French. And the French controlled and claimed everything you see in pink, and the British controlled or claimed everything you see in red. And it's a terrible name for a war because it was really the French and most Native American tribes against the British, the American colonies, and some other Native American tribes who wanted to use the British to basically defeat their enemies. In the end, long story short, the British did win. The British gained control over everything you see in pink here, and even the French-speaking peoples along the St. Lawrence in the Canadian province of Quebec came under British control, although they were permitted to keep their language and their Catholic faith. Which is why Quebec, to this very day, within Canada, has its own very distinct culture. And at that point in time, everything west of the Mississippi River became Spain, and later, once Mexico became independent, Mexico. More on that later. So Canada became independent eventually after the American Civil War in 1867. You probably don't have the dates memorized. In 8th grade history, you should have learned that the Civil War took place in the United States between 1861 and 1865. After that, the U.S. military was very powerful, and the British were concerned that we would look north and go, hey, Canada's not very well defended, and it's not an independent country. Let's make it part of the United States. So the British decided to allow Canada to become independent, and so the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island formed the initial Canadian Confederation in 1867. So Canada became an independent country almost 90 years after the United States. So we're going to fast forward in history, zoom, 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 and answer the question, how have things evolved between the United States and Canada in the modern era? So I posted a little quote there from John F. Kennedy. Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners. And necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature hath so joined, let no man put asunder. It's kind of a cool quote. So the United States Civil War drove the British to make Canada strong and independent. So people often lump the U.S. and Canada together, but they have two very different histories and different cultures. They also have a lot of similarities, but Canadians really resent being lumped in with the United States because they believe they have their own history and culture, which they're very proud of, and rightfully so. The United States and Canada fought as allies during both world wars, World War I and World War II. Something called NAFTA. When we discuss economics, we're going to take a look at NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North America Free Trade Agreement. It has since been replaced by the USMCA, which stands for the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement. But it's essentially the same thing, just modernized. A lot of economic cooperation takes place, and there's something called free trade, which we're going to talk about when we talk about economics in a few weeks. And Canada has a very different government and value system. We are a republic. We have a president. We have a Congress. We have a Supreme Court. We have separation of powers. Canada operates on the Westminster parliamentary system. So Canada does not have a president. It has a prime minister. Technically, the King of England is still considered the head of state of Canada. And you will see pictures of the monarch on Canadian banknotes. And the prime minister is part of the Canadian parliament. So their executive and their legislative branch are essentially one, whereas in the United States we separate the executive branch from the legislative branch. More on that when you become juniors and you take American government, or you might remember some of that from second trimester social studies in middle school. Hopefully you do. So, are there any challenges in the current relationship between the U.S. and Canada? Now, this is likely to change very soon. President Biden is not running for re-election, and candidly, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Canada is not very popular and is likely to lose the next election. But currently, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is the leader of Canada, and President Joe Biden is the leader of the United States. We occasionally have trade disputes with Canada. Lumber is a very big issue. Dairy is a very big issue. And so each country tries to get advantage over the other. But these things are usually negotiated in a very friendly way. In the USMCA, that was definitely an issue. Canada does not always support U.S. military intervention. So there's been some things the United States has done militarily where Canada has said, we're going to take a pass. So, for example, Canada did not participate in the Iraq War in the early 2000s. And they have some different laws. Canada does not allow guns and has no death penalty. So they do not have a Second Amendment, and they do not have capital punishment in Canada. So there's some definitely cultural and legal differences there. But, you know, this is one of those things where we agree to disagree, and they can have their laws and system, and we can have ours. And it does not break the relationship. It's a very friendly relationship. Sometimes there are Canadian and American leaders that don't get along quite as well, and I'm not going to get into that in this lecture, but just as with all people, sometimes we get along well with the leaders, and sometimes we do not. So, how do the economies of the U.S. and Canada compare and contribute to the world economy? The first thing you need to know is Canada has a population that is about 10% that of the United States. So the population of Canada is roughly that of California. So this goes back to 2019. So as of this recording in 2024, it is 5 years out of date. But as of 2019, the United States accounted for 25%, rounding of course, of the entire global economy, and Canada accounts for roughly 2% of the entire global economy. So Canada's economy is actually less than 10% that of the United States. But you'll notice that the United States and Canada are the only two North American countries that are even represented there. Mexico, by the way, 1.43. More on that in the Latin America unit. So Canada is heavily dependent on trade with the United States. If we were to cut off trade with Canada, the Canadian economy would largely collapse. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the economy of the United States and the economy of Canada. And then the military budgets. The military budget, this might be interesting for you to observe. Take a gander at that, children. And again, this is 2019 data. If and when I update this slideshow, I will get more up-to-date data because this is 2024 when I'm recording this. The United States spends $731.8 billion a year on the military. And I guarantee you that's even more now. Officially, China spends only $261.1 billion a year, but the Chinese budget is a very opaque instrument, and I would not put a lot of credit in those figures. And honestly, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that aren't publicly disclosed that our military probably does, so this number is probably much higher for us as well. But literally, the rest of the world is $241.1 billion. Again, these numbers have probably shifted. Russia, for example, that's probably much higher because they're engaged in war with Ukraine right now. So, but just take a gander at that. The U.S. military budget is more than 1/3 of the world's total. I'd argue it's closer to half. And Canada barely shows up. And just like Canada is reliant on trade with the United States, it's also very reliant on U.S. military protection. The idea being, you're our next door neighbor. You're not going to want any bad things to happen here. If something goes down, you're going to come protect us. So Canada is at $22.2 billion. And I will tell you that is controversial. There's a lot of pressure on Canada to spend more on its military and carry its own weight within the NATO military alliance. More on that in the Europe unit. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is your brief overview of the history of the United States and Canada. Obviously, that's not intended to be all-encompassing, but hopefully you have a better sense now of the similarities and differences between the history, the culture, and the economic activities in both countries. And if you do, I have been successful. This is Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the McKay Social Studies YouTube network.